Presidente.
Good morning. The sitting is open. The first item on the agenda today is the report by Mrs. Moy and Mrs. Sommer on cloning of animals kept and reproduced for farming purposes. I do understand that Mrs. Moy is not here, but Mrs. Sommer is here, and I will therefore ask her to take the floor. Then, if Mrs. Moy joins us, she will address you. Mrs. Moy, you have the floor. Mrs. Sommer, sorry.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much indeed, President. First of all, I'd like to thank my co-rapporteur, Ms. Moy. We engaged in exemplary cooperation and we agree on what we are presenting to Parliament at first reading stage. There are two draft directives from the Commission and they are going to be merged into a single regulation which would apply equally to all member states. When we're talking about a fundamental issue such as cloning, it's extremely important for all member states to act in the same way, in keeping with the fundamental tenets of the single market. We want cloning to be banned because it is bad for animals. 10% is a figure that's been put forward in terms of the success rate, and it's pretty minimal. That's according to EFSA, because the technique of cloning is not fully mature, and in fact no further progress has been made with this technique. The mortality rate remains equally high. The very few animals which are not stillborn actually suffer from deformities, either of their extremities externally or their inner organs, and they have weak immune systems and respiratory tract problems. This means that many of the animals which are born alive die in the first few weeks, and they die painfully. Should we allow that? Isn't it our task to ensure that animals can live in conditions of welfare? It's true that we're not talking about direct use in the European Union, but we're talking about third countries in North America, perhaps South America, and in China, for example. And we are profiting from that because up to now it means that we've been able to import reproductive material. And is that the right thing to do? Is it right for us to say that we have nothing to do with cloning techniques, but that we want to have the materials necessary? This is a cosmetic exercise. We are washing our hands of responsibility, letting others do the dirty work, but we want to profit from the success. But going back to the success rate issue, the mortality rate is extraordinarily high. And there are certain biological limits that apply when you're dealing with animals. At some stage, the body of an animal used for breeding purposes is exhausted. And here we're trying to make animals more and more packed full of muscles. We're trying to increase the yield of dairy cattle as well. And when do we cross the border between that and cruelty to animals? I mean, should we allow for cloning? Not just the cloned animals which survive suffer, but the dams also suffer. The surrogate mothers, animals surrogate mothers in other words. And there's a high proportion of caesarean births. And there's another point which the European Parliament has always paid attention to, and that is the concern expressed by citizens in the EU. It is a fact that all of the reproductive techniques which have been developed for livestock purposes, for breeding animals purposes, usually end up being used for human purposes. So people don't want to have cloning because they are afraid that cloning might ultimately, once it works properly, ultimately at some stage be used for humans. So here what we're talking about is something which is at the very root of our human existence, and our citizens do not want to have cloned meat on their plates. And for this reason, we want to ban comprehensively not just the use of cloning techniques in the European Union, but also the import of reproductive materials, the import of clones and their descendants, and fundamentally, we want to have mandatory labelling for things which might already have ended up on our market. Is that unrealistic? We don't think so. Traceability is possible, as was proven with our experience on feeds and foods and GMOs. It is possible to introduce a traceability system which operates worldwide. And if the Commission is saying it's not possible for livestock, well, that's not true, because there are pedigree books, breeding books, stock books available. So, in fact, it's quite effective being able to trace the pedigree or the origin of an animal. So it is all feasible. I'd like to ask the Commission to rethink this whole thing, and I'd also like to urge colleagues within this House to support our joint report from Giulia and myself, because you will be doing something to help animals, you'll be doing something in terms of the community of values of the EU. We have a responsibility incumbent upon us as members of the European Parliament. Sometimes politics have to set the limits, so please help us to establish these limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sommer. Mrs. Moy. You have the floor.
President,
fellow members, the Parliament has the possibility today to take on a significant responsibility, which is to get the message across to our partners in trade and our competitors in trade in the Far East and the US as follows. We're not willing to put our own health, our family's health and future generations' health at stake using products of dubious provenance and quality of this nature. Our farmers are currently faced with major competitive pressure from Asia, particularly due to certain practices, including cloning. But Europe is based on values. That includes quality rather than quantity being appreciated in Europe. Cloning and the sale of products within the EU of products derived from cloned animals is an issue of major concern for us, and we feel that it would be appropriate to be highly sensitive to this issue. We need to take account of animal health and welfare, and we also need to take account of the possible impact on human health of the instability that can come in because of the changes, the surrogate mothers' deaths, the antibiotic and hormonal treatment causing instability and suffering. We also need to look at the nutritional value of food from cloned animals, or from the offspring of cloned animals, more importantly. This is something that we should take account of in terms of trading with third countries, because this is something that could put humans at risk too. So it is our responsibility to protect citizens' health, and this means we have to take responsibility for any trade in or use of such products. Do we want our families and future generations to be guinea pigs? That's the question. The times we're living in now are times in which there are all sorts of paradoxes in the food industry. There's obesity and malnutrition at the same time. We don't want to make the situation worse by using products that have not been adequately scientifically tested. So our decision in this report was that we should ban such practices within the EU, that we should have labelling of products derived from the offspring of cloned animals, taking account of the fact that in the past the European Commission had developed a system on these matters. We've also decided that we should not allow such practices to be used for profit making purposes, for instance, as is currently the case with racehorses. So we should ensure that we don't go down a path from which it will be very hard to come back. There's a point of no return, and we want to avoid that. So our aim in producing this report should be borne in mind by all of you today. Please do take account of this. We just don't have studies, adequate studies, to tell us about what could happen if you eat food derived from the offspring of cloned animals. So you all have a significant responsibility today, ladies and gentlemen. Think about your children. Think about your families. Think about the future. Imagine if your children are sick in future. You don't want them to be guinea pigs, do you, for these companies who will be making a profit at your and your family's expense?
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the Commission, I would like to give the floor to Commissioner Andriukaitis, please.
Dear President, honourable members, first let me thank the two rapporteurs, Mrs. Renate Sommer and Mrs. Giulia Moi, for the report we have in front of us today. I very much appreciate your hard work and commitment. I am also pleased to see that Mrs. Sommer and Mrs. Moi fully support the bans on cloning which have been proposed. I also agree that any measures taken now would need to be reviewed at a later stage. These points aside, I regret to note that amendments would leave little of the initial Commission proposals. Let me remind you that the Commission had proposed to ban the use of cloning technique in the European Union for 5 species and the import of live clones from third countries. I must reiterate my support to these initial proposals. I am confident that they protect the health and welfare of animals, allow for innovations where desirable, and take into account citizens' concerns. The report that we are discussing today seeks to enlarge significantly this reasonable ban to include descendants of clones as well as food and feed from descendants of clones. It also seeks to enlarge to the ban to all animal species and their products. President, honourable members, last February we discussed all aspects of cloning. I remember that on that occasion I explained that the proposal was shaped in light of comprehensive analysis of the legal powers available, a rigorous assessment of impacts, and consideration of the principle of proportionality. The current Commission has upheld these proposals because they are well balanced and respect the legal framework within which we all must operate. Unfortunately, I am afraid that many of the amendments of the report we are discussing are legally impossible or disproportionate. Allow me to explain some of the Commission's reservations. The report seeks to enlarge the scope of descendants of cloned animals. However, descendants of clones are conceived through conventional methods and therefore create neither food safety nor animal welfare concerns. It follows that all measures proposed regarding descendants of clones and food or feed obtained from such descendants can only be justified on ethical presumed concerns. To support the view that such extended ethical concerns exist, the report points to the 2008 Eurobarometer study. Indeed, it can be drawn from this study that a majority of European Union citizens disapprove of cloning. However, If we look closer, it reveals that half of those interviewed thought incorrectly that animal cloning involves genetic modification. If half of the interviews formed their opinion on incorrect presumptions, the outcome of the study has to be treated with a great deal of caution. Indeed, the results have insufficient credibility to justify far-reaching measures with significant impact for our agriculture. In addition, in line of argument to justify measures on descendants appears to be that even if animal welfare is not compromised in cloned descendants, their very existence is an animal welfare concern for ethical reasons. Allow me to express the Commission's doubts as to using this distant link to animal welfare concerns as a justification for such a wide ban. Finally, the Commission, as guardian of the treaties, has an explicit obligation to respect the legal limits of the treaty. In the case of cloning, the treaties do not provide specific powers to address the ethical concerns that are the motivation for most of the amendments proposed in the report. Measures that are motivated essentially by ethical concerns can only be proposed under Article 352 of the treaty, the flexibility clause. The flexibility clause allows the Union to act beyond the power of action conferred upon it by the treaties if the objective pursuit so requires. For that reason, any proposal based on Article 352 must be adopted separately under a different legislative procedure. President, honourable members, I recognize that the idea of manipulating animals as if they were simple objects creates resentment and is perceived as morally wrong. As the same, however, I firmly believe that the Commission has proposed sound and justified measures that represent a balanced and workable approach to address the issues of animal cloning and to reconcile science and ethics. Therefore, we should proceed on this basis. Thank you.
Mulțumim și noi.
Thank you. Thank you very much.